Hi there, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria. I'm known primarily as a fencer, as a user of swords, but I have also in my life used bows quite a lot, and I do occasionally, as regular viewers of my channel will know, make videos about archery. And a video or an extract from a TV programme has recently come to my attention, which I'm going to analyse. But first of all, I just want to point out that one of the underlying problems that we often encounter when people are making videos about archery, particularly about medieval English archery and the use of the longbow in the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, which I've made videos about in the past and I'll link below. But there are essentially 5 problems that we often encounter, and people have a lot of assumed understanding of this period and the use of longbows in this period and the effect of arrows on armour. And a lot of this comes from film and TV and culture and even reenactors and living history people. And there's a lot of myths out there, and there are 5 common problems that we often encounter. First of all is a fundamental misunderstanding of history. Okay, so that's usually that comes down to, well, I'll analyse that in a minute, but it usually comes down to people assuming they know history, they know things about the Battle of Agincourt or the Battle of Crécy, when in actual fact they don't, they've just heard things by word of mouth. Secondly is, whenever we get into the analysis of the effect of arrows and longbows, therefore, on armour and on medieval opponents, medieval soldiers, they often use the wrong type of people. Okay, so we're not using, very often in TV programmes, they don't use people who are a fair analogue for a medieval English archer. The next problem is bows, the bows themselves. Okay, very often in the past, in this video we're going to look at, the bows aren't correct. Next up is the arrows, and that includes the arrow heads and the whole arrow as an object. Okay, and finally it's the armour. Very often in these kind of tests and in TV documentaries, what is used to simulate armour isn't very much like actual armour. Okay, so we've got problems with misunderstanding history, problems with misunderstanding the people that actually used these bows and these armours and this equipment, the bows, the arrows and the armour itself. Okay, so now let's have a look at this video and we'll break it down point by point.
In 1415, Henry V led the English into battle against the French. Historians have always put this triumph down to the most feared weapon in Europe, England's trump card, the longbow.
Okay, so the first issue we have here is that the narrator says that the longbow was a feared weapon in Europe at the time. It was. The longbow had been used in the Italian wars by mercenary companies such as the White Company and the Great Company, and English archers had been used and were later used as well as mercenaries in the Holy Roman Empire, used by the Germans in Bohemia and elsewhere. So yes, the longbow was a feared weapon, but the narrator is implying that actually it wasn't a good weapon at all, and this doesn't make sense when you've just said that it was a feared weapon and then to say, but we found actually maybe it wasn't very good. There's a strange paradox there, but anyway, let's plough on.
But new research is beginning to tell quite a different story. So Henry's army was mostly made up of archers, but they were there because they were cheap, not because of their skill.
Whoa, 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 whoa! They were only there because they were cheap and not because of their skill. Okay, I call bullshit on this. The fact is they cost 6p per day, which was actually relatively expensive for a medieval foot soldier if we look at Europe as a whole. So, you know, the French in many of their campaigns had used locally raised militias, sometimes crossbowmen, other types of foot soldiers who were incredibly cheap and perhaps in some cases were paid almost nothing at all. So English longbowmen were not cheap. They weren't there because they were cheap, and in fact even further than that, we have in the sources references saying that they had to meet certain types of standards. They had to be able to provide certain equipment for themselves, and they had to be able to shoot their bows. If they couldn't meet these standards, then they weren't going to be recruited. There were a far larger number of people wanting to be English archers than they would actually accept. So they could take the cream of the crop, they could actually take the best soldiers out there. So they definitely weren't just there because they were cheap. Yes, they were cheaper than knights, cheaper than men-at-arms in general, but they weren't cheap soldiers. They were actually relatively expensive to build an entire army out of.
So what was it about the longbow that gave these men the power to overcome vastly superior numbers?
It's a very simple weapon to use. You draw your bow back, a full draw.
Okay, so and here we encounter one of the fundamentally massive problems with this documentary. We have Hector Cole, who's a very respected blacksmith and maker of arrowheads, as it happens. I own several of Hector Cole's products myself, and he's a really nice chap and makes really good stuff. And I'm sure he's a perfectly competent archer. However, in this video, he is not holding a medieval style longbow, which are commonly known these days as war bows and are usually modelled on the Mary Rose bows. What he's holding is actually a Victorian style target bow. It's not a medieval style longbow. Usually the dead giveaway is when you have a handle, a wrapped handle section in the middle. That's not the defining feature. There were medieval and Renaissance bows which had wrapped handles. However, medieval war bows tended to not have wrapped handles. The really important difference between what Hector's showing in this documentary and a real medieval war bow is, first of all, the power. You can clearly see from the thickness of this bow that it's nowhere near the poundages that we see from the Mary Rose bows, which seem to range from about £100 draw weight up to about £180 draw weight. There's some argument about the exact parameters, but we're talking about bows above £100 draw weight. This bow, from the look of it, I'm guessing, but it's probably about a £70 draw weight longbow. So I'm not saying it's a weak bow, but it's not in that range of the medieval war bows, the sort of £120, £140 draw weight. Equally, it's a different type of bow. A Victorian longbow has a stiffened section in the middle and bends in a sort of D shape. Okay, a medieval Mary Rose style war bow bends what's known as full compass. That is, it bends all the way through the bow and doesn't have a stiffened central section. Additionally, it's a different cross section. If we sword through the middle of the bow, Hector's bow there, the Victorian style bow, is very much a D shape. It has pretty much a flat front of the bow, and then the back, as it's called, and then the belly of the bow, the bit pointed towards you when you're holding it, is the curved part of the D shape. It seems that medieval English very heavy war bows weren't exactly really that shape. They were more of a almost like an oval shape. They were more of a round, less of a defined D shape. So what Hector's using here is not a medieval war bow. It's a Victorian style target shooting longbow, and so therefore it's a different weapon. It's a similar weapon, but it's a different weapon, and it's not fair to make comparisons using essentially a different type of bow. And so here's the next big issue. Hector, while I'm sure is a perfectly competent longbow target archer, is not drawing his Victorian style longbow in the medieval manner. He's not putting his body into the bow. He's not drawing as far back as medieval English archers seem to have generally drawn the bow. And in fact his anchor point is really quite far forward, even by target archery standards. So we have a problem there of not only is the bow not correct, the weapon's not correct, but equally the man is not correct. In this case, nice chap though he is, Hector is not a warbow archer, at least as far as this documentary shows. He is not putting his whole body into the bow. He's not drawing back far enough, essentially back to the ear, in some cases even further. So he's not drawing as far back, he's not storing as much energy in the bow, and the bow itself is not powerful enough and is not the right type of bow as well. So the weapon is wrong and the man is wrong.
The longbow's power lies in what it's made of. A unique combination of two types of wood growing naturally within a single tree. The yew. On the outside, the elastic sapwood. On the inside, the rigid heartwood.
The heartwood on its own would break, but the sapwood is a tension wood, in other words a stretchy wood, and the sapwood stops the heartwood from breaking.
The The longbow is not only easy to use, it also has a quality that could help a small army make up for a shortage in numbers.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! A shortage of numbers? There's a constant implication in this documentary that the English army was somehow tiny in comparison to the French army, and that's why they used longbowmen, so that they could get lots of people in the field. This is bullshit. If we look at the invasion, that Edward III's invasion that led to the Battle of Crécy, or indeed if we look at the Henry V's invasion that led to the Siege of Harfleur and then the Battle of Agincourt, they invaded with thousands, tens of thousands of people. I believe that the number of soldiers, English soldiers, that sailed across to Calais on the Agincourt campaign with Henry V was in the region of around 12,000 men. That's big. That is a big number of men. The reason that at Agincourt they would diminish was because of dysentery, because during the siege of Harfleur, lots of the English army got ill. In fact, lots of them were sent home, and some of them died. And we know this all from the records. We've got pretty good records, unusually good records for that campaign. So actually, no, we can't use the English army was tiny, so that's why they used longbowmen. That makes no sense, because the English army wasn't tiny.
They were shooting off anywhere between 8 to 12 arrows in a minute. As long as they can do that, they can put this blanket firepower down.
Well, I'm not one of those people who's going to complain about the use of the term firepower, because it's a very useful word. Of course, any archer will go, oh, it's not, you're not firing the bow, you're shooting the arrow, because there's no fire involved, it's not a firearm, it's a bow. But I'm not going to be one of those people, because firepower is a useful term. In terms of the 8 to 12 arrows a minute, that is conjecture. I wouldn't say it's unreasonable, I don't have a big problem with it, but lots of people have repeated this 12 arrows per minute, 12 arrows per minute, like robots, because one historian read another historian who read another historian who said 12 arrows per minute. I have raised this topic several times in videos, and allegedly there is a record in the National Archive, which is one of our archives of historical documents in Kew in southwest London, and it allegedly refers to the number of arrows that an archer is supposed to be able to shoot. However, I and nobody that I know has ever actually clapped eyes on this document, and it essentially talks about, I believe, sending archers home because they couldn't shoot the required number of arrows per minute. How did they time a minute in the 14th or 15th century? I don't know, maybe with a sand timer or something, an hourglass, I don't know. Or they perhaps just counting. But anyway, this 12 arrows per minute thing is a pervasive, I would call it a myth, until we see a historical document backing it up. That's not to say that it's not unreasonable to shoot 12 arrows per minute. I think that, yeah, that's, you know, for a practiced archer that might be reasonable. However, I do know some warbow archers who question that, because when you're pulling very heavy draw weights, and we do know these bows at this time, from the size of the arrows and from the Mary Rose bows, we know that they were heavy, heavy bows. When you're pulling these very heavy draw weights, it does reduce your rate of fire, because your body is going through an enormous amount of exertion. It is a bit like weightlifting. It's going through an enormous amount of exertion to be able to pull these heavy draw weights. So if you're focusing on power, that will obviously reduce rate of fire. Okay, so if we're looking at someone like Lars, who shoots the arrows pluck, 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 at very high rate of fire, he's not pulling the bow far back at all, and on top of that it's an incredibly weak bow. With a big heavy war bow, it doesn't seem like it's really designed for a high rate of fire. If you wanted high rate of fire, you'd go with a lower poundage. It actually seems, looking at the arrows, the arrowheads, and the size of the bows that we have historically surviving, it seems like they were focusing more on power than necessarily rate of fire. But anyway, let's carry on.
What gave the longbow its crucial advantage was the speed with which it could be shot. It was 4 times as fast to reload as other weapons of the time, such as the French crossbow.
4 times as fast as other weapons of the time, such as the French crossbow and the Italian crossbow and some crossbows, such as which other weapons of the time? Why not just say crossbows?
The longbow is not an accurate weapon as such. It's a weapon of mass firepower. You're pushing as many arrows over as you can and causing as much havoc as possible.
Well, again, I would question that for the aforementioned reason. Actually, the English longbow is very specifically a heavy draw-weight bow, so it's not built for rate of fire, actually. It's built for power, and it can be shown that the power output from a heavy warbow is equal to a very heavy crossbow, in fact. So, no, I don't agree. The Mary Rose bows are not built for high rate of fire. They're actually built for power.
There were 5,500 English archers, each loosing an average of 10 arrows a minute. So in the opening moments of the Battle of Agincourt, 55,000 English arrows would have rained down on the French knights.
Whoa, that's making a massive assumption. That's making the assumption that all the archers, as soon as they were within bowshot range, would just start pouring arrows at the enemy. Does that make sense? Does it make sense to expend all of your arrows when the enemy is a really long way away and when your arrows are going to have the least effect on them? Think about this for a second. Ignore the charging horses. Yes, there were horses at Agincourt, but most of the French forces were on foot. They advanced on foot. I believe there were about 800 French on horseback, which is a relatively small number. The cavalry charge seems to have achieved nothing. Probably the horses got shot to pieces, yes. The main French army that was defeated was an army on foot. Now, how much armour members of that army were wearing on average, we don't really know. However, raining down arrows from a long way away, coming down onto helmets, and pretty much even the poorest soldiers, if they have no other armour, if they just have a woolly jumper on, they wear a helmet. Okay, the helmet is the most fundamental piece of armour, and we even know that there were helmets made out of coiled rope and leather and all sorts of things. Okay, so protecting your head, just like a modern builder or anybody, a modern soldier in fact, wearing a helmet is incredibly important. Okay, so pouring down arrows where they're going to have their weakest possible effect from a long way away doesn't make sense and isn't supported by the historical sources. If we actually look at the historical sources, it seems that the English provoked the French to advance by putting some arrows onto them from extreme range, and there are references to the English army moving forward to extreme bowshot range to provoke the enemy, so put a few arrows down, provoke them to advance. However, if we look at Froissart's Chronicles, for example, there's specific descriptions of flat shooting, as I've talked about with Toby Capwell in my videos from a couple of months ago, of flat shooting at very close range, and there's mention of penetration of the sides of the visors, and the French men-at-arms being worried about the sides of their visors being penetrated by arrows. And if we look at the historical artwork, it's actually very rare to see archers doing this unless they're in a siege and the opponent is up on a wall. Usually in battle scenes, the archers aren't doing this. The archers are usually doing this, shooting absolutely straight, almost point blank, straight at the enemy. So, I actually think it's highly unlikely that at Agincourt or any other mainstream English-French Battle of the 100 Years' War, or indeed English-English wars during the Wars of the Roses, I think it's very unlikely that most of the archery was doing this, like modern clout shooting. I think the vast majority of the archery, they would save their arrows, a bit like later, wait until you see the whites of their eyes. I suspect that they provoked them at extreme range, and then they saved their arrows, because remember, once you run out of arrows, the archer, the longbow, is useless. The longbow's just a stick then. It's the arrow is the actual pointy bit, the bit that's going to do damage to the enemy. So I think it's highly likely, and I think all of the sources support this, I think it's highly likely that they saved most of their arrows for piling in that high rate of fire that people keep talking about. They would save that till really the last moment when they could shoot in the flanks and they could shoot flat. And think about the target as well. Then you've got arrows, less arrows coming down onto deflecting helmets and shoulders, and more arrows coming in flat at places where there are likely to be openings in armour, in armpits, in insides of the elbow, in back of the knee, in sides of helmets, underneath in the aventail, these kind of things. Okay, so flat shooting is far more likely. Very unlikely that they just poured all their arrows at maximum range and then ran out of arrows when the enemy came close.
Henry's archers could clearly create a storm of arrows. But what damage did these arrows do when they reached their targets? With a high-speed camera, the energy of an arrow leaving a longbow can be accurately calculated. A bodkin arrow weighing 63 grams.
So again, to reiterate here, we've got essentially the wrong type of bow being used, probably a much lower draw weight, and equally it's not being drawn, fully drawn back all the way as a heavier weight warbow would be. So it's being used by essentially someone who's not a warbow archer, not drawn in the right way, so not used in the right way, and it's the wrong weapon. And on top of that now, we can now see it's the wrong type of arrow being used as well. So what's wrong about this arrow? Well, essentially we can see that it's narrower than most medieval arrows are, and the reason for that is undoubtedly the power of the bow. The power of the bow is not very high, so therefore the arrow is correspondingly of a narrower diameter, making it of a lighter spine essentially. But additionally they have a square section bodkin on the end. This is not the type of arrowhead that was actually particularly prevalent at the time of the Battle of Agincourt. It was actually a type of arrowhead that was popular earlier on against mail, aka chainmail. So this type of, in fact I've got one on this arrow here, this type of square arrowhead is designed to break open the rings of mail. It's not designed to penetrate plate, so we wouldn't expect it to do so. But anyway, let's plough on.
A bodkin arrow weighing 63 grams records a speed of 37.9 meters per second. The energy arrived at in mathematical terms is 38 joules.
So 38 joules. Well, I happen to know that warbows being shot by warbow archers have reached more like 70 joules. So the energy that they calculated out of Hector's bow with Hector's arrow is, so it's a lighter arrow with a weaker bow, and it's the wrong type of bow, and it's being shot in the wrong way by someone who's not a warbow archer. It can be shown now that the joules, the energy that's put out by that bow, is quite significantly lower than what people shooting heavyweight Mary Rose style warbows, who are warbow archers, can actually generate with a big livery heavy arrow. So that right there makes the whole experiment somewhat moot.
To see what would have happened when a bodkin point met armour, this result is fed into a high impact machine. It recreates the crucial moment. At the receiving end, a piece of 2mm thick mild steel, equivalent to the metal of the day.
Okay, so a piece of flat 2mm mild steel equivalent to the armour of the day. They're not totally wrong, okay? 2mm is not an unreasonable thickness for something like a helmet or a breastplate. In actual fact, a lot of pieces of armour were thinner than that, right the way down to 1mm or even less in some cases. Is mild steel similar to medieval steels? Well, that's how long is a piece of string. That's a difficult thing to analyse in terms of penetrative resistiveness. Mild steel is modern cast rolled steel. It is very unlike medieval steel, which was not created in a Bessemer converter. Medieval steel was essentially formed in a forge using iron and charcoal, and therefore it had lots of impurities in it, lots of slag, and all sorts of inclusions which modern factory made steel just simply doesn't have. In that sense, you could say the mild steel is actually better than a lot of the steel that was used in the medieval period. However, by the time of Agincourt, so we're talking about 1415 AD, there was some armour which was carbon steel and heat treated. Okay, we actually know of that they were trying to heat treat quite a lot of armour, but usually, or very often, the armour was of a low enough carbon content that the heat treating didn't have any effect. If you take a piece of mild steel and heat it up to red heat and quench it in water, it doesn't really do anything because there's not enough carbon for that chemical hardening process to happen. If you take a piece of carbon steel, so slightly higher percentage of carbon in it, heat it up to red heat and plunge it into water, it becomes very hard. It also becomes brittle, and that's why you have to temper it. But the fact is that we know that they were trying to heat treat quite a lot of armour by the time of Agincourt. However, it is fair to say that most armour at the time of Agincourt was probably still iron or very low-grade steel, and therefore not heat treated. The problem for me with this 2mm sheet is that it's completely flat, which very little armour is really. Armour's pretty much entirely domed or curved, or it's very unusual to find a completely flat piece on any piece of armour. But equally it's laid on something that appears to be quite solid, which seems quite weird, because obviously that solid thing behind the steel is preventing the steel from deforming at all. And the deforming, so when an arrow hits a piece of, say, a thin piece of steel, which we know we can shoot through, let's say 0.8 of a millimetre, when it hits that piece of steel will buckle and will kind of bend in at that point of impact, and that helps focus the force and actually can assist penetration. Sometimes it could help resist penetration, but it has an effect. It has an effect that is, you know, worth measuring and worth noticing. If you place a flat sheet of steel against a flat hard object so it can't deform, we're now going to get a very different reaction to how a sheet of steel on a person's body over a gambeson or over mail, how that will react. So they're not using a target that really is very like armour at all. Only debatably, in the material that it's made of, is it more or less similar to the armour of the day, and in thickness it's more or less similar. But the way that it's set up is quite dissimilar to how armour is on a person's body.
600 years later, a bodkin point once again tries to penetrate armour.
Whoa, 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 what's that? Let's just have a look at that arrowhead. That is a long bodkin, a type of bodkin that's almost certainly designed for wounding soft targets, perhaps getting through gambesons, perhaps for getting through mail, aka chainmail. This isn't designed to hit plate. I know what's going to happen when that hits the plate. It's going to bend.
And fails.
Yeah, bent. How unsurprising was that? They picked probably the most fragile type of bodkin, or the most fragile type of medieval English war arrowhead that they could find, and they pitted it against a piece of steel plate that was placed on a solid flat surface. What? What are you doing? It's like this experiment was set up to fail. It's like, we want it to fail, we want it to fail. And you know, I have tried to make clear through all of the videos I've done about longbows and armour and Agincourt and all of this stuff, I don't have a horse in the race. I don't desperately want armour to win. I don't desperately want longbows to win. I just would quite like to get a bit closer to the truth, and I think that's what people should be looking for. But this experiment, seriously, it's like it's been set up for the arrow to fail. They've used a weak bow, the wrong type of bow, not a warbow archer, producing quite a lot less joules of energy than should be produced by a Mary Rose style warbow. They've used the wrong arrow, they've used the wrong arrowhead, and they've mounted a flat piece of steel on a flat surface where it can't deform or go anywhere. What did they expect was going to happen? Yeah, the long, thin bodkin was going to bend, and it bent. Wow.
The weaker English bodkin arrow simply buckles when it hits the steel.
But the long, thin bodkin was never designed to go through plate armour. That's why it wasn't used at that period against people in armour. Type 16 heads and short bodkins, and if you look at any crossbow head, they are short, fat, chisel-like, robust things. They are designed to be shot into people who might be wearing armour. It's just ridiculous. It's like they've taken a weapon from a different period and gone, but it doesn't work in this other period against this other type of armour. No, of course it doesn't, because that's not what it was designed to do.
Legendary use of the longbow and the hail of arrows only account for the opening minutes of the battle. The fighting at Agincourt continued for another 2 hours. The longbow simply could not have been the decisive weapon history has claimed.
So to wrap up, my conclusion, because the conclusion of the TV programme is complete horseshit, so I'm going to make my own conclusion. My own conclusion is that this experiment was rubbish from the start. It was set up to fail to penetrate the plate. However, there are other experiments which were clearly made by longbow fans that are designed to succeed and penetrate plate in equally unfair conditions. Because the armour's not right, or it's not even... Like, sometimes people count it as a success when they get that much penetration through a plate. That wouldn't wound a person. If you look at a breastplate, for example, it's not even going to be touching the person. So there are all sorts of other videos out there showing armour penetration and the success of the bow, which don't really show any kind of success at all, either because they're using something that's not like real medieval armour, or they're not actually achieving decent penetration anyway. So there are all sorts of problems with this topic, and like I say, I'm always a big fan of trying to see experiments that actually represent something closer to the truth and closer to reality. And what I would say is, longbows clearly were incredibly important in English warfare and Anglo-French warfare throughout the 14th century and well into the 15th century. We know that huge numbers of longbowmen were used not just in the 100 Years' War against France, but they were also used in England's own, essentially, civil wars, the Wars of the Roses, English against English. They were also used as mercenaries in Italy, very successfully, against Italian armies, under Sir John Hawkwood and such like. And they were also used as mercenaries in Germany and other parts of the Holy Roman Empire. The fact is that English archers very clearly were very effective at doing what they did, which was shoot bows. And yes, English longbowmen weren't just archers, they were also swordsmen to an extent, and this is recorded in many sources that English longbowmen were could be quite formidable in hand-to-hand combat as well, using sword and buckler, or using even polearms in some sources. So they were multi-purpose soldiers. They were a bit similar to modern day, or we could say Second World War soldiers, where, you know, they had a missile weapon, but they would go in with the bayonet as well. They would take ground, and, you know, they didn't just stand there and shoot. They were multi-purpose soldiers. And some archers did wear degrees of armour themselves. If we actually look at 15th century, particularly archers at the time of the sort of time of the Wars of the Roses, by that point it seems, according to the artistic sources, it was quite common for archers to be wearing a sallet, a plate helmet, sometimes even with a visor, which they'd raise for shooting, with a brigandine, in other words a coat of plates, over a mail shirt, over a gambeson, sometimes with plate leg defences, sometimes even with plate arm defences. So some English archers were really quite heavily armoured as well, which would of course make them less vulnerable to enemy arrows, but equally make them more effective in hand-to-hand combat as well. So English archers very clearly were reasonably well paid, multi-purpose, effective soldiers, and their longbows were a big part of that. And all of the laws in England around the practicing of archery weren't there just for fun. You know, they banned football, they banned golf and cockfighting and all these other things in the British Isles so that archery could be promoted. That wasn't just for, you know, it wasn't just a whim. It was because archery was effective. Now, Agincourt, let's come back to Agincourt. Why were arrows so effective at Agincourt? Not because arrows have to penetrate plate. I keep mentioning the same point, and so many people who talk about this topic completely ignore this point. And this point is that the majority of the French army at Agincourt would not have been wearing full plate harness. They might have had elements of plate armour, but if you pour enough arrows into people at point-blank range while they're engaged at the front in hand-to-hand fighting, or while they're advancing, either, I don't mind which you do, if you pour enough arrows into them, the people who aren't wearing full plate harness, aren't wearing full plate armour, are going to get arrows stuck in them. And whether it kills them or whether it just wounds them, it's going to vastly reduce their willingness to fight or ability to fight. And even the people who are in full plate harness, you don't need to penetrate a breastplate or a helmet in order to wound a person with an arrow. There are lots of gaps in a plate harness. If it hits someone in any of those junctions around the neck or around the back of the legs or the inside of the arm or the armpit or any of these places where there are gaps, the arrow is going to go in there and it may well burst a ring of the mail if they've got mail there, or if they've only got padding, it's going to stick in the padding. It's going to wound that person. It's going to make them far more likely to surrender or just stop fighting or retreat or whatever. Okay, so arrows have so many ways of being effective, and penetrating a breastplate or a helmet is so far down the list it's not even worth considering. If you get a bunch of guys with a mixed amount of armour and you pepper them with arrows, they're probably gonna stop trying to fight you at some point. Cheers folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.